In other news tonight, G7 finance ministers have been holding an emergency meeting to discuss surging oil prices as a result of the war in the Middle East, which has now entered its second week. SABC News correspondent Nich Harper has been tracking the developments from that G7 finance ministers meeting. Nich joining us live now on The Full View. Nich, good to see you as always. So one of the options on the table for these G7 finance ministers is basically the unlocking or the release of these petroleum reserves. But am I right in saying it's not quite a done deal just yet?
Not quite a done deal yet, it would seem. We're still waiting for further details from the US side, some potential readout of that meeting. But the G7 countries getting together, the finance ministers, trying to decide really what options they have at their disposal. And there is, of course, that emergency button that they could press. And that's releasing strategic oil reserves, about 300 to 400 million barrels that could be activated really to ease the squeeze on oil that we have seen over the course of the last 10 days since this conflict began. I think there has been real momentum as a result of the fact that we've seen oil prices surging past $100 a barrel, rising to the highest levels we've seen in 4 years. And that really has been the motivating factor to bring together the G7 countries to see if there's something they can do to release more oil onto the market and therefore bring down prices. Unclear if they're going to do that, but we knew that going into the meeting, at least according to reporting from the Financial Times, 3 of the 7 countries, including the United States, were on board with that possible plan of releasing the strategic oil reserves.
And what other options do they have, I wonder, Nick, when you consider that ultimately the parties involved in the war in the Middle East, and one of them, part of the G7, the United States, appear nowhere near taking their foot off the pedal here in terms of the actual war itself?
Well, that's right. And Donald Trump has been speaking in the last couple of hours, giving an interview to NBC about whether there are other options when it comes to oil, specifically asked whether it may be a case that the United States would try to take Iran's oil. Think back to the beginning of January when the US carried out military action against Venezuela. It removed the then President Nicolas Maduro and ended up striking deals that allowed the United States access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves. It's the largest crude oil supplier anywhere in the world, untapped reserves there that the US was able to get its hands on. So the president was asked whether he would consider trying to do a similar thing in Iran and take Iran's oil. He said that it was too soon to discuss such things, but bear in mind about 80% of the oil that Iran produces is exported to China. So if the United States was trying to get its hands on Iran's oil, it could potentially see some roadblocks with China. Undoubtedly, they would not want to see oil heading to the United States and not heading towards China instead. So it is another option, but at this stage, 10 days in, the United States seems hell-bent on continuing military action. Negotiations in terms of trying to find a diplomatic path forward certainly do not seem to be the current mood in Washington, on Capitol Hill, at the White House or at the Pentagon. None of those assets here in the United States seem to want to move towards diplomacy. Military action is still the order of the day.
And the Brent crude oil price today went beyond the $100 US dollar mark, right, a few hours ago. What is the reception among the American population? What do they make of the financial consequences, both in the short term and possibly in the longer term, of a war started by their president?
Well, the war in the Middle East has a very immediate and direct impact on US consumers. The vast majority of Americans own a car, at least one vehicle for some families, and they have seen, in the course of the last 10 days, prices at the pumps increasing by 15% in some cases, in other cases up to about 20%. The average cost of fuel right across the country to fill up your car has risen, and risen very dramatically. So whether or not US consumers believe that this action was necessary in the Middle East, what they are seeing is their cost of living expenses rising as a result of that action. And if we look further afield towards the midterm elections, Donald Trump is not on the ballot, but many lawmakers will be, and they will need to answer to the average American who are already worried about the cost of living, what the Trump administration has done to try and get the issue of affordability under control. And many Americans will simply say the action in the Middle East has cost them more. It is now costing them more to fill up their cars, and potentially further down the line we could see the cost of other goods increase as well. So at this time, with the US not really signalling any de-escalation, there is that fear amongst average Americans that things will continue to rise in price at a time when we know, according to polling, 3 out of 5 Americans do not agree with the military action that the President Trump has undertaken in the last 10 days.
And the G7 group of nations, it's worth noting, Nich, is made up primarily of European countries. They've not been under this much pressure in terms of the price of fuel since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they too will now be feeling the pressure, right, to basically try to appease their domestic populations who simply cannot afford to be stretched further financially.
Well, that's right, yeah. 4 of the European countries, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, all of them have that consideration after several years of already feeling the strain and the pressure as a result of that conflict in Ukraine. And that has put increased pressure on them now, especially as we've seen this Middle East crisis widen, because already the United States and Israel taking action against Iran firing back against other countries in the region that host US bases. And in the course of the last 24 hours, NATO has also got involved as well, downing a missile that entered Turkish airspace. Of course, Turkey is a NATO member, and that pact that NATO members signed means that they come to the defence, come to the aid of any NATO member that is threatened. So suddenly all of these European countries that are involved in NATO find themselves directly being drawn into this conflict as well. And we already know that there has been very much a lukewarm response from some of the major leaders in the UK, Germany, France to this conflict. They haven't exactly backed the US president in his action. And although they've said that Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon, they haven't fully endorsed the need for the US president to carry out this action now.
Nich Harper, always good to talk to you. Nich is our SABC News correspondent, live for us in Washington, as always.